Please, Professor.
Okay.
3, 2, 1.
Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening for those of you who are coming in from Europe and Middle East and North Africa. And a late good morning to our friends in the West Coast and Hawaii and the Pacific Ocean. I want to welcome you all to this very wonderful event today. My name is Bill Granara, and I'm the director for the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard and the director of the Tunisia office of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies in Tunis, Tunisia. It is a great pleasure for us at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies to co-host this event. It's a webinar by Mounia Bennani from the University of Lausanne, who will be introduced to you by Mohamed Haddad, who is our co-sponsor of this event. Mohamed is a Mason Fellow and a co-chair of the Arab Caucus at the Harvard Kennedy School. So without further ado, again, I want to welcome you all to this wonderful event. It's a pleasure for us to as I said before, to repeat co-host this event. And I turn the microphone over to my esteemed colleague, Mohamed. Tafadhal ya Sidi.
Shukran, Professor Granara. It's such an honor for us and for the Arab Caucus and for myself that we co-sponsor this event. Thank you so much, and for the Center for Middle Eastern Studies for making this happen and for this partnership. And thanks, Professor Mounia Bennani for accepting our invitation. It's our honor. Inshallah, Ramadankum mabruk al-kull qbal kull shay. And then let me start by presenting our guest speaker today. For more than 30 years, Mounia Bennani, you have been conducting field work in political sociology. As a Moroccan researcher, you have mainly been interested in the relationship to politics, namely the different forms of political participation or the distance from politics. And you approach this theme from different angles: the representations of the world of young urban students between 1988 and 1991, the neighborhood associations, the electoral mobilizations, the social movements, and political commitment. Mounia Bennani, you are a professeur ordinaire at the University of Lausanne, known as UNIL, which is the highest ranking position in Switzerland universities. In addition to teaching and research, you held during the last decades various positions, among which director of the Institute of Political Studies, co-director of the Research Center on Political Action, CRAPUL, and Vice Dean, Faculty of Social and Political Sciences. Today, we are exploring protesting and political parties in Morocco, following the publication of your book, which is right here. I have the pleasure to have it on paper. And on the cover of this book, we can see a question you ask. You say, is Morocco a kingdom where a king is expert in survival and endowed with a divine barakah, which is grace in Arabic? And is this king expert in playing with plots and oppositions? Is it a word where everything changes from party acronyms to the tricks of power so that nothing changes? As you write, this is a seductive common sense, or rather a cliche, that you debunk throughout your book. So through a long-term investigation, Professor Schreiber, you put in enigma violent or latent political struggles without dissociating protest dynamics and partisan logic. Thanks again for being with us. And let me start by this first question. Since you started conducting research, have you observed any changes in the conditions of the fieldwork?
First of all, thank you very much for your invitation. I'm really happy to be with you. Yes, of course, when I began my fieldwork on young people in 1988, any mention at all of the word politics, siasa, made people nervous. I had to go to great lengths to reassure people, but with the political liberalization of the late 1990s, speeches really was liberated. But in recent years, these conditions have changed, especially when it comes to investigating issues considered sensitive, for example, the Hirak protest movement in the Moroccan Reef.
I just presented this book, but I mean, what was the starting point of this book that I just for the people who are following us, I will share the link. It's available online for free. The copyright has been offered by the University of Lausanne. So what was its starting point?
Initially, I wanted to study the characteristics and pathways of Moroccan political party members. I wanted to understand what makes some people join political parties while others reject them. Between 2008 and 2012, I conducted a questionnaire survey within the national congresses of 10 political organizations. I had team support in built-in a database of well over 4,000 Congress delegates. As I was already well underway with writing a book based on this data, I began writing a contextual chapter, which gradually turned into a book, this book, on the conditions of the development and transformation of the partisan political landscape in Morocco. For the most part, I have tried to move beyond the reading prevailing in works on post-independence Morocco, which tends to explain everything in terms of the existence of an all-powerful monarchical institution.
And so your book covers a long period of time and deals with a range of aspects, but what would be its main issue?
A central question is this: what structures political conflicts in a changing authoritarian context? In other words, what are the underlying cleavages in conflicts between social and political groups? These are conflicts that involve the state in one way or another.
And so, if I move to the historical perspective on the political parties, so in general, what is the role of political parties in structuring the political conflicts?
Let's consider the opposition between the left and the right. According to studies on the formation of political parties in Western Europe, I'm referring to the Rocanian perspective, this opposition crystallizes a set of social cleavages: opposition between the center and the periphery, the urban and the rural worlds, the workers and the owners, the state and the church. So, according to this perspective, it was political parties that played the role of structuring national level political competition around these cleavages. And this is referred to as the nationalization of political life. For example, in parliamentary elections, people's votes are not based on local issues or client relationships or local proximity.
And let me ask you about the political parties. Have they helped structuring the political conflicts in a way?
In Morocco, a contrast emerges out of the history of Moroccan political parties. They were fundamental, both during the Protectorate and well beyond it, to structuring political conflicts after independence. But this is no longer the case. So please allow me to explain. From the 1930s onwards, the first political parties sprang up in the struggle against the Protectorate, and therefore in connection with protest dynamics. They were at the forefront of developing a vision of the nation to be liberated and constructed, and played a major role in the nationalization of politics. In addition, a few points must be kept in mind. These parties evolved underground in a state of siege under a colonial regime. They developed within a nationalist project that was both unanimous and hegemonic, and the creation was unrelated to the organization of elections. It should also be noted that their presence was essentially urban. Now, let's take independent Morocco's first elections, 1959 and 1963. Rémi Levau's analysis reveals a central cleavage between the urban and rural areas. According to him, the urban world, home at that time to just a quarter of the population, was sensitive to the discourse of the opposition, the parties of national movement. Conversely, the rural world was more controlled by local elites. These were essentially landowners seeking to preserve their own social and economic standing, frightened by the urban nationalist elite programs, especially with regard to agrarian reform. Until the mid-1970s, power struggles were fierce. Between 1965 and 73, the regime was attacked from all sides. Urban revolts, attempted coups, insurrectionary attacks, etc. Die-hard opponents were suppressed and others were exiled or imprisoned. And in the end, when Hassan II sought to stabilize his regime, it was repression that shaped the emerging official political space. Between 1976 and 1997, Moroccan elections were not competitive, but despite everything, the cleavage observed by Rémy Levaux persisted. What I have called the activist parties had a collective capital in the same of French political scientist Michel Offerlé. This capital has several dimensions, symbolic, for example, a political brand, organizational, structured apparatus on a national scale, and material, subscriptions, premises. These activist parties were especially popular in the cities. In the contrast, the parties of notables, Ahzab al-A'yan, enjoyed the support of the administration, hence the name administrative party. And thanks to this A'yan, they mobilized votes, especially in rural areas. These local elites controlled electoral mobilization through their personal capital, name, social status, economic resources, social dependencies. A paradox arose alongside the relative political liberalization that began in the late 1990s. The arrival of the so-called consensual alternation government, le gouvernement consensuel d'alternance, heralded the affirmation of parties having significant collective capital. But in fact, it was the practices of Ahzab al-A'yan that were spreading and becoming more sophisticated. While opposition parties seemed to fight first for political alternatives in the 1960s, then for change within the framework of the institutions from the mid-1970s onward, the major parties on the electoral scene since 2002 at least are competing for mandates. A cartelization of political parties is underway.
So can you tell us more about this cartelization of political parties? What do you mean exactly?
It's known cartel parties have several characteristics, not only in Morocco. They have weak ties to the members and depend largely on state funding. What they have in common outweighs what differentiates them. This is a collusive system that allows resources to be distributed among the key players. The main challenge for the leaders of these parties is therefore to maintain some balance in how the cake is shared. In Morocco, this collusive dimension is reinforced by the characteristics of executive power. On the one hand, there is a hegemonic and an accountable monarchical institution. On the other hand, there is a governmental executive whose room for maneuver is further reduced in that it consists, at least until September 2021, of heterogeneous coalitions. More generally, in this type of executive, certain channels are weightier than others. And these are the channels of political domination that are organized independently of institutional channels. This is what is known as the deep state, الدولة العميقة. In this configuration, it's difficult for a political party to mobilize voters around a given political platform or political brand, with the notable exception of the Party of Justice and Development. Up until 2016, no political party has succeeded in winning a parliamentary election by drawing on these registers. For the established parties, this doesn't really matter. On the whole, they have adapted. Up until 2021, you didn't need a high number of votes to participate in government, as we have seen with the Party of Justice and Development, the PJD, a party having an Islamic referential. A party can strive to demonstrate its loyalty to the monarchical institution, yet this will not prevent it from being seen as dangerous in the eyes of both the palace and its opponents on the electoral scene, as long as it has autonomous resources, a solid activist base, and grassroots support. Moreover, what is the point of producing programs, knowing that the major orientations are turned out by monarchical institutions that relies on commissions and McKinsey and what else? So elected representatives are not in any position to determine the major public policy issues. And all of this paves the way for talk of a crisis in political parties.
Crisis of political parties, that's something that we've been hearing about a lot, but like what, how would you analyze it exactly in this context, this crisis of political parties?
I will mention just a few aspects. Speeches on the crisis of political parties are produced by different kinds of actors, citizens, voluntary or partisan actors, international institutions, the king, journalists, scholars, etc. Generally, the speeches stress weaknesses and dysfunctions, fragmentation, the absence of internal democracy, alienation from both activist bases and citizens, the race for mandates, corruption, partisan transshumance, etc. It is, however, important to emphasize the extent to which these negative images are the mirror image of ideal representations of a political party. Though such representations vary depending on who has produced them, they tend to reference an organization with a political identity, which produces programs and has a vision of the world, an organization that brings dedicated people together and trains up leaders, a representative organization rooted in society, which can serve as an intermediary, even as a counterpower, a virtuous organization bringing together virtuous actors, malaika. Broadly speaking, these representations refer to the image of parties of the masses or of activists, and it's very interesting.
And from there, I want to move to a very important part of your book, which are the speeches that you've been analyzing. And so, what was exactly that interested you in these speeches?
I have tried to understand the function of the speeches. For example, let's consider the 2001 and 2004 throne speeches. In the sections on political parties, the king presents himself as an enlightened prince. He speaks of the dysfunctional aspects of the parties, guiding them, urging them to rehabilitate themselves, to become scholars of democracy, in tune with the times, to act in the general interest, etc. In so doing, he echoes a set of three narratives currently in vogue. The first of these seeks to legitimize the monarchical institution. So the king is good, the political class is bad, classical. The second is that of ordinary citizens. All members of the political class are thieves. And the third is that of one part of the elite. It is better that the king appoints competent people. Okay. All of this is designed to justify taking strategic matters out of the hands of elected officials and giving them to bodies appointed by the king. In other words, to justify such interference with the democratic exercise of power. Another aspect that should be taken into account is the fact that when accusations of incompetence emanate from circles of power and one segment of the elites, they are also manifesting a type of class struggle, or at least a struggle between different types of elites. In fact, such accusations were aimed above all at elected representatives of the PJD, which took over government in the wake of the 2011 protests. On the whole, these representatives do not come from the same background as the technocrats promoted by the palace, who tend to have degrees from foreign universities and fluency in foreign languages, as well as experience either in senior public services or business. These people thus belong to a very specific segment of the elites, which is why I consider it a struggle, a class struggle. These elites seek to maintain their status, the way of life and privileges, and in a way they expect the monarchical institution to help them do this. One problem the palace faces is how to keep the king from being reduced to no more than a member of this elite. Perhaps the king of the poor register is intended to counterbalance this. Another problem is how to keep protesters, from focusing their grievances on the monarchical institution. This was particularly striking from 2017 in the context of the Haddad protests of the Reef. Indeed, the 2017 throne speech clearly addresses this issue. I quote, "When the record is disappointing, we hide behind the royal palace and blame it." It was as if the palace realized that it had run out of fuses to blow, yet this didn't stop it from doing everything it could to get rid of the PJD.
And ultimately, how would you explain that political parties are like struggling to perform a representative role for their citizens?
I would say it is more a matter of the parties dominating the electoral scene having neither the means nor the will to shape the conflicts that affect society. This does not, however, prevent elected officials from intervening via clientelistic links in order to facilitate access for some constituents to services or resources. I would rephrase the question. In a given context, what makes political parties prefer certain strategies or select certain profiles over others? And I have already begun to answer this question. It's not a simple matter of virtuous or corrupt men or women. There is no country in the world in which political actors are angels. Ego and personal ambition are always at work, which leads me to another question. What are the conditions that encourage or hinder the conciliation between individual and collective aspirations? Answering this question demands that we take into account not only individual or ideological variables, but also institutional and political context, as well as the history and internal dynamics of organizations and repression.
I might have a question that wouldn't end with a question mark, but so in your analysis, the model of the parties of notable Ahzab al-Ayan has spread, at least electorally. Is that, am I understanding right?
Absolutely. For many years, activist parties were an inspiration for the parties of Ayan. In the aftermath of independence, the first notable parties borrowed heavily from the parties of the national movement, a founding congress, a program, however minimal, premises, sometimes a press organ, or even scouts. But since 2002 at least, it is the renewed party of the notables that has become a source of inspiration, including to former activist parties. In this respect, the 2021 election campaigns suggest an exacerbation of a dynamic that has become clearly evident since 2007. Firstly, a kind of hybridization is underway. For example, I have heard ordinary electoral agents from parties of notables present themselves as activists, يعني مناضلين. And within the same movement, we observe the standardization of a set of practices, outfits, etc. Secondly, the model of the party of notables has begun to spread at least in terms of the mobilization of votes. Consider the election campaigns of the National Rally of Independence, a party created by the administration in 1978 and which won the 2021 elections. Its candidates certainly benefited from and harnessed exceptional material resources. Its president is one of the country's wealthiest businessmen. But I also want to draw attention to other aspects. This party has had recourse to very hybrid ways of mastering votes. Money, clientelistic and proximity networks, lobbies, perhaps even the support of certain agents of the administration, or simply anticipation of the benefits that can be derived from the proximity of its president to the palace. Yet, this campaign, which began well ahead of the official campaign, adjusted itself to various voter profiles, combining the different registers of legitimization valued in the official discourse, the politics of proximity, al-qaraba, the virtues attributed to entrepreneurs and technocrats. It used innovative political marketing techniques. There was an offensive digital campaign similar to those of large electoral machines. In short, the National Rally of Independence of 2021 is not the same. It was back in 1978. One key point remains to be made. While the activist parties may have unraveled, large parts of society have reappropriated the repertoires of action they promoted. And this is important.
So, speaking of action, I know that our talk, and even from which is inspired from the title of your book, is about political parties and protesting. So until now, we've been talking about the political parties, but what about protesting?
The protests have mutated in several ways. I will mention 4 points in particular. First, from the end of the protectorate, the nerve center of the protests gradually shifted from the rural areas to the big cities. Since the end of the 20th century, mobilization has spread to medium-sized and small towns, and even to rural areas. In 2011, at the peak of the February 20th movement, which lasted almost a year, mobilizations occurred simultaneously in around 110 localities. Second, the protests became relatively peaceful. By the end of the 20th century, the coercive apparatus had more and more resources and had learned to repress without the bloodshed of 1965, 81, 84, 90. And for their part, protesters resorted to violence less often. Third, the protests have become autonomous from the partisan sphere, and the trade unions no longer have a monopoly on protest initiatives. This is reflected in the diversifications of the profiles responsible for initiating mobilizations. It is no longer just students, unionized workers, employees, and civil servants. Slum dwellers, street vendors, and women such as Soulaliet, 2008 until 2011, have started to organize autonomously. In other words, the most vulnerable are no longer in need of the opportunities created by the trade unions and political parties as they were in 1981 or 1990. According to my hypothesis, the transformation of Moroccan authoritarianism has produced a paradoxical effect. The fact is that some institutional arrangements have made it possible to integrate a part of the political elites, the Equity and Reconciliation Commission, the National Council for Human Rights. The official discourse has appropriated such notions as human rights. The associative network has developed, though many of these associations are client-driven. In addition, there are regular campaigns, election campaigns. Now, in my opinion, all of this has contributed to the dissemination of standards, practices, and modes of action previously confined to activist groups. It has also encouraged the development of social networks, and not only via Facebook and WhatsApp. It is important to bear in mind that the very networks mobilized to buy votes can also be mobilized to protest. The February 20th movement of 2011 certainly played a key role in both the diffusion of practices and the constitution of networks, both online and offline. Lastly, I will give another example, if you allow me. During the 2018 mobilization of Douar and Casablanca, inhabitants had to organize autonomously in order to protest against their displacement. They put together a dossier, produced leaflets and chanted slogans, demonstrating organizational skills that vulnerable people had not had back in the 1970s and the 1980s, or even later. They were ultimately defeated. Okay, but this is evidence of profound transformation.
And what would be the conclusions that you drew from these transformations? And just a quick mention to people who are following, thanks. Let's keep the questions coming. We will soon open the floor for your questions, and thanks for again being with us. So what are the conclusions?
I draw two main conclusions. First, it certainly is difficult for Moroccan political parties to accumulate collective capital. The authorities have done all they can to reduce the collective capital accumulated by organizations like the PGD, Al Ihsan, and the Moroccan Association for Human Rights. And at societal level, though clientelistic relations and individual strategies are persistent, there is no denying that capacity to organize collective action has increased. Second, political conflicts struggle to find expression via the ballot box. Instead, Moroccan protest arenas have become the main venues for the expression of political conflicts. Moreover, some of the slogans heard here and there show that a central cleavage is emerging, that between Ouled Shab, the sons and daughters of the people, who are treated with contempt, al-Hugra, and those the protesters consider plunderers of the public good. What's more, accusing the Hirak protesters of being separatists has done nothing to prevent their slogans from spreading to other areas of Morocco. The fragmentation of the country that was observed in the aftermath of independence, if only in terms of the repertoire of action, no longer exists. The revolts and armed conflicts that took place between 1959 and 65 suggest a plurality of forms of action. But consider the mobilizations of the February 20th movement, which were happening almost weekly in several localities over a period of just under a year. These were characterized by a great similarity in terms of performance, slogans, and even representations of allies and adversaries. All this illustrates my point about the nationalization of politics via the margins rather than via the ballot box. These structural transformations create the potential conditions for the spread of protests, while there is no room for the expression of conflicts within an institutional framework. And the rulers seem aware of this. This may help explain the repressive turn that has intensified since 2017. Fear of outbursts is revealed in the excessive demonstrations of force we saw when tanks were sent out in some cities at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, or in the face of small demonstrations, very small demonstrations against the vaccine pass during autumn 2021. This repressive turn can, of course, also be explained by the current counter-revolutionary context, by the COVID effect, but this will not last forever.
Building on this enumeration, Professor Bennani Shraibi, and this will be my last question before opening up to the floor. What are the horizons?
starting point is, I want to say that despite policies aimed at fighting poverty, the Moroccan state has weak redistributive capacities. It is incapable of clientelizing the whole of society. Country's economy is struggling to create jobs. Migration channels are almost closed, even outside of the pandemic period. Moroccan society has undergone major changes in terms of demographics, social values, access to education, opening up to the world. Yet, these changes struggle to crystallize at the political level, and not only in Morocco. So, what would be enough to guarantee the country's long-term stability? Is it enough that the political elite is fragmented, even if it is satisfied with what it has? Is it enough that the that the palace is seeking to rekindle nationalist sentiment, so as we saw back in 1975 at the Green March, La Marche Verte? Is it enough to have powerful forces of repression along with external allies willing to feed them, including Israel? One idea that has certainly gained ground in the current counter-revolutionary context is this: a regime can hold on to power mainly through repression, yani Assad. But in terms of capacities, Morocco is not Russia and it is not China. Finally, and this is my last point, all this raises a classic question. To what extent can an authoritarian regime sustainably protect itself from entropy?
I think that with this question, we're going to open it up for the floor. Thanks again, Professor Bennani for this very insightful talk. Just a quick reminder, this book is available online. It's in French, and you can download it. The copyrights were bought and made available for everybody. We have a question from the chat, but if you don't mind, Professor Bennani, may I read it to you from Ki Jiang?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the question is, what is the attitude of people toward the monarchy? Does this institute have the advantage of stability? The people obviously know the king is in control of everything.
Oof. It's a large question. I will say that we know trends, but we don't have a kind of sondage. We know the trends, okay, but yes, I think that there are people who want stability and who consider that the monarchy is guaranteeing the stability, but there is also other people that considering that this monarchy is very repressive. So we have trends, but not I can't say 90% of people are monarchists or 90% of people are against the regime. We don't have this kind of data.
And there's an important, so please keep the questions coming in. We thanks Kijang for asking that question. There is a point, an important actor, which is the PJD. If you could tell us more about the PJD, not only as a party in Morocco, but whether that as an Islamist phenomenon in general, what would be your take on that?
in my point of view, we heard since the announcement of the electoral collapse of the PGT in September 2021, some have proclaimed the failure of Islamism, while others have marveled once again at the subtlety of the Moroccan monarchical institution. While the said Islamists were bloodily crushed in Egypt and eliminated after a coup de force in Tunisia, in the kingdom, transparent ballot boxes would have made it possible to get rid of them. And such narratives hide the exacerbation of the representation crisis. And in my opinion, the argument that it is a failure of Islamists doesn't hold water. First, the PGT is only one of several political trends having an Islamic referential. Second, while it certainly owed its triumph in 2011 and 2016 legislative elections to an electorate that was receptive to its religious and identity-based values, however, the PGT had also raised hope among voters who did not subscribe to its ideology, who relied above all on a political staff in a position of supposed integrity, who would fight corruption. The PGT did not lose its electorate because it's implemented an Islamist policy that proved ineffective in the eyes of a part of public opinion. It turned out to be a political party like any other. And like other government parties before it, it had to implement policies it had opposed while in opposition. What's more, it has had to swallow quite a few bitter pills, such as the normalization of relations between Morocco and Israel. Fourth, since the appointment of Saadetdine Othmani as head of government, 2017 until 2021, his party, the PGD, has experienced increasing internal tensions in connection with Othmani's options and those bitter pills, not to mention his communication problems. Moreover, some PGD activists refused to mobilize or even vote in 2021. And though the PGD was already led low, it was targeted by electoral laws and multi-form campaigns aimed at bringing it down. Ultimately, the Moroccan political system is a machine that crushes parties having a political brand and social roots, whether they are Islamist or leftist, or indeed of any other political affiliation.
Thank you so much for your answer. There's another question that came in from Yasmina Abu Zahur, who is a research fellow here at the Kennedy School. And Yasmina, if you want to ask your question yourself, please feel free. But yes, please go on.
Hello, Professor. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I research Arab monarchies and focus on Morocco, and I wanted to ask you if you could tell us a little, based on your research for this book, about studying protesters in these types of authoritarian countries. Experience, it's perhaps elites are more accessible to us as researchers, but it might be more difficult to access protesters or the wider population. So do you have any advice for us? Thank you.
I didn't hear all the question. It was the last part of the question.
So I, just as a researcher on monarchies and on Morocco, I wanted to know if you had advice on studying protesters versus elites or members of the wider population in these authoritarian systems.
Oof, it's a huge question, but I can speak with you talk about your research. Mohamed can give you my email because it's a very big question. I think it will take more time than the time we have.
I'll do that. And for all of the people who are in the room, I will send the link of the book right after our meeting. There's a very important question, Professor Bennani, that I forgot to ask, which is, do you give us the permission to record?
Yes, of course.
Thank you so much. I forgot this from the beginning, but still we have some minutes left, and at least it's in the recording. So there are two other questions coming in from Khalil Dahbi. Khalil, please feel free to jump in and ask your questions to Professor Bennani Shraibi.
Hello, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Yes.
Yeah, all right. So my question is, how do you see the position of the more radical opposition groups like Al-Adwa al-Ihsan or Al-Nahj Democratic within the current political situation in Morocco, and as they could be seen as maintaining an activist party system and not following the notables model, and they remain outside the electoral game and focus mainly on protests? How do you place them within your framework?
Yes, Al-Adwa al-Ihsan and the Nash and other political organizations are the kind of activist organization, political organization. But you know that the capacities and the resources and the collective capital of Al-Adwa al-Ihsan is not the same that the one of a Nahj Democratic, and it is due to a long history, to the kind of repression Al-Adwa al-Ihsan was had to deal with, and the kind of repression Nahj had to. And in the book I try to analyze the impact of the repression on the pathways, on the capacities of this kind of organization, why Al-Adwa al-Ihsan succeeded in accumulating collective capital, an important collective capital, and why it is not the case of Al-Nahj. And I analyze this in the book. But now, as I said, the regime do everything to crush this collective capital, the collective capital of Adwa al-Ihsan. Nahj, it's very difficult to have the Congress, to have. So we are in a period in Morocco, and you are a small organization or a big organization, you are submitted, you are targeted and repressed.
Thank you, Khalid, for your question. I think, thank you again, also Professor Bennani Shraibi, for your answer. Fadila Filelis Zekzuti, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, you also asked a question that is related to the PGD. So please feel free to join us and to ask your question live, or if you can't, I can read the question.
I don't know if you can hear me.
Perfectly well.
Okay. My question was, would you say that the PGD participated on its own fail? Like, would you say that their activists, being aware of not being able to have as good scores as they had, they just didn't vote for themselves or for their other candidates? Would like to not have an identical destiny as the USFP, to not be forced to integrate the governmental coalition and to ensure their place in the opposition?
I think, Fadila, that you have the answer. I think that your field work was very interesting. Yes, I think it's a hypothesis that the destiny of the Union, the USFP hierarchy, was a kind of archetype. So for some people, yes, it's not a problem because the USFP succeed to be in the government and to provoke a kind of blockage, even with very few mandates. So they adapted. But a part of members of the PGD didn't want to have the same destiny. I agree with you.
Okay, thank you.
I know that we are like getting very late for you, Professor Bennani Shraibi. It's almost 10 p.m. in your place, and if you're hearing drums, here is a demonstration right now going on HKS against a study group held by an Israeli officer. So sorry for that, but it's good that the demonstration is going on. If you have any other point that you would like to raise, Professor, or if Professor Granara wants to make any comment. So Professor Bennani Shraibi, this is your opportunity to share with us your last thoughts.
I want just to say that it was very important for me to try to go beyond some biases in the literature, and that's it. So thank you very much for your invitation. It was a great pleasure to be here with you, and thank you again.
And thank you, Mounia. And thank you, Mohamed, as well. Anyway,
thank
good
you
health
all.
to everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
And bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.